Hello there, men, and welcome to the Masculinism Movement channel, a place for men to be men and talk about masculinity and men's issues. I'm your host, Brian Crawl, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the male mental health crisis and the problems with psychotherapy causing it. Modern society and feminism are causing not only social issues for men, but psychological issues and an entire mental health crisis as well. There are a number of mental health disorders that men suffer from more than women, but female mental health issues seem to get more awareness and activism, just like everything else. And the entire field of psychology and the social sciences altogether, in general, is a female-dominated field. 80% of therapists and counselors are women, and only around 30% of therapy patients are male, in spite of men needing help with more issues than women do. And studies have suggested that, quote, mental health services are inherently feminized. And that quote is coming from a publication from a study done by Morrison et al. In 2014. And I can personally attest to just how problematic this can be. When I once got myself a psychotherapy workbook, and the author, who was a female, kept trying to get the reader to imagine themselves as a scared little girl, regardless of their gender. And that was obviously a problem for me as a man, all right, because I'm not transgendered. And I'm not trying to think of myself as a scared little girl, for no real reason. She was, trying to do this, and yet it seemed weird that, it would be a little girl, and she wasn't trying to get the female readers to think of themselves as little boys. Right? So that was obviously a problem, and I can also attest to just how problematic it can be to have mental health issues that are not getting proper treatment due to the problems with modern psychotherapy. And the only reason I feel comfortable with broadcasting the fact that I have mental health issues is because I know that many men out there are undergoing a widespread mental health crisis, evidence of which can be seen quite easily by simply looking at statistics of suicide victims, where 3 times the amount of which are male, probably having taken their lives after being financially bankrupted by a morally bankrupt woman in a divorce and losing his house and his kids too. In fact, the CDC states that even though men are less than 50% of the population, they make up 80% of the suicides. I wonder why that could be. I'm sure it probably has something to do with the fact that they are so oppressed by the matriarchy, and the field of psychotherapy is just a feminist arm of it. And not only that, but the fact that in this feminist socio-political system that men are subjected to, they also aren't getting the mental health help and resources that they need. In fact, even though women suffer less from mental health issues, they actually get more mental health resources. And I've noticed that, as with all issues, the mental health issues didn't seem to become real issues to society that got any kind of media coverage or socio-political resources until women were suffering from them, right? But men have always had these burdens to bear and needed this kind of help. But we didn't really have any resources made available to us by the government until it was a female issue. And when a man tries to seek help and go to therapy, he's dealing with another female-dominated sphere that treats him like the enemy, someone who needs to be stifled and suppressed. In fact, most therapists these days can hardly be trusted not to try to emasculate the man and turn him into a woman, just like that workbook that I told you about. And even in the best case scenario, men who seek mental health treatment from a therapist are going to end up spending their resources on another thing that is meant to profit off of them more than it helps them. They're lucky if it is even helpful at all, for psychotherapy is generally quite ineffective. There is no guarantees that it will work at all, right? You don't get any guaranteed results when you sign up. You have to pay a lot of money, and in the end, it may not have helped you, but a little bit at best in most cases. And while I know many of you out there are probably very surprised to hear that, like, oh, well, of course therapy works, because most of you people love commenting on videos like mine saying, oh, just get therapy, bro, just get therapy, as if you could just go to a therapist and have your psychological issues cured and solved just like that. But unfortunately, it doesn't actually work like that, or often at all right? So allow me now to make the case for you against therapy and tell you exactly why it does not work. First, for starters, psychology is actually not a hard science. It's a pseudoscience at best. It relies upon unproven theories and is more of a philosophy than a science. and even more of a religion, oftentimes, to some therapists who are extremely indoctrinated into their school of thought, which they believe in very strongly despite not having much good peer-reviewed scientific data and evidence. You see, there are actually no good objective studies out there proving the effectiveness of therapy. And those that do exist do not follow the scientific method properly. All right, they are not good science. They are flawed by human error, such as researcher bias and contamination by outside variables and conditions, and thus they cannot be replicated. No psychological studies have ever been successfully replicated. There is a huge replication crisis going on in the field of psychology that is now making people question whether or not it can be qualified as a science at all, as some studies try to get replicated and then fail to replicate. All right. So psychology is in essence without any adequate objective scientific proof. And also there is plenty of evidence and studies out there showing how psychotherapy is the opposite of helpful, but is harmful and even dangerous. Unfortunately, though, those studies often get suppressed by the psychotherapy community for fear of losing business. And that is what it is, a business, not a science, but just a business. And it is a highly profitable one at that. Now, when it comes to dealing with a therapist who is going to treat you and the types of treatment you will get, what you must understand is that there are different degrees of therapists and different schools and types of therapy that they can get degrees in. But when you ask your doctor or your insurance for a referral, you have no idea what you are getting into. Oftentimes, your doctor will refer you to some generic therapist who simply works at their practice, and they're the one you are getting referred to simply due to that affiliation. Right? Or if not at that practice, then with the network, right? Other times when you seek out therapists, you end up with someone who is a counselor or worse, a social worker rather than a psychologist or psychotherapist. And these types of people have very low levels of qualification. And my experience with getting treatment with them is so bad, I would say that every single session I have done with someone who's called a counselor or a social worker was either a ridiculous waste of time due to their severe lack of intelligence, intellect, and education, or a downright disaster due to them being completely unprofessional and probably having a personality disorder themselves. And many, if not most, therapists do have mental health disorders themselves. Many, if not most, therapists actually get into the mental health field because they have their own mental health issues that they want to be able to figure out. But unfortunately, their poor mental health makes it difficult for them to adequately and appropriately treat others who are mentally ill. So most therapy doesn't go anywhere and is just mental masturbation for people who are masochistic snowflakes. And all the time really just gets wasted whining over menial things rather than doing actual problem solving and getting mentally well and cured, which therapists will never tell you they can actually do for you because they don't. Which brings me to our next point, which is that therapists mainly counsel without diagnosing people these days or treating them for and curing them of the diagnosis. I was just watching a video on testing and diagnosing people with personality disorders and couldn't help but wonder to myself, how come multiple therapists I talked to recently, when they asked me what I was looking for and I said testing and diagnosis, they literally said to me, quote, "There are no tests for mental disorders." And then I asked, well, how do people get diagnosed? And they said, by talking to their therapists. And I was left wondering, out of all the therapists I've seen, how come no one has taken the time to diagnose me with anything except general depression? It seems to me that providing diagnoses should be, the basis for mental health treatment, but is somehow a thing of the past that doesn't happen anymore. But without diagnosing a person, they can't be properly treated, but they don't seem to care about this because they're really just doing it for a paycheck. So that they could take the easy road of just, clocking in and clocking out and spending the day just sitting there listening and, talking, well, mostly listening. They generally don't even do much talking. They just sit there listening. And when they do talk, they say very, very little and will just, ask the patient to go on or ask them, how does that make you feel? But they don't actually counsel the person. They don't act as a consultant who is there to try to help provide answers and solutions. Therapists do not provide solutions to their patients' mental health problems. Instead, they just try to prompt the patient to solve their own problems by venting their feelings and then trying to ask open-ended questions and give the patient space to cultivate awareness so that the patient can try to figure out a resolution almost entirely on their own. And so, unfortunately, though, the patient's problems generally don't get solved this way because awareness just isn't enough. All right. And if people could solve their own problems based on awareness of them, they wouldn't have to come to therapy, right? They would just be doing it on their own because awareness isn't enough. And a lot of patients don't even attain much awareness because they simply aren't capable of it, right? Which is part of the problem and why they need more intervention. The awareness they've generated on their own is about as much as they can without the therapist literally intervening and saying, okay, let me tell you what is going on here. But therapists don't want to do that. So not only do the therapists not help with their problems, but oftentimes more problems are then occurring in the meantime. And therapy is really just spinning the wheels in the mud and going nowhere for long periods of time. Essentially, the therapist is doing little to nothing for the patient for countless hours at a very high hourly rate. Oftentimes it's not an hourly rate, it's like a per 45 minutes now because most of those in the field have gotten so much greedier. And how many hours does it take for a therapist to help you resolve your issues? Well, since there is no guarantee that their therapy will work for you at all, many people will do a session a week or more every single week for years, even sometimes decades in some cases. And the patients will be in therapy for so long, not because it's working so well for them, but because it isn't working well enough. And the therapist is basically just a crutch for them. Many people go years without seeing much benefit at all, but invest all that time, energy, and money to just spinning their wheels in the mud, simply because they've got no one else to talk to about their emotional issues, and the therapist is really just exploiting them for that. And speaking of which, therapists expect you to instantly open up and tell them about all of your deepest, darkest secret feelings, pain, and traumas without consulting with them and vetting them and building any kind of trust in them first, or getting to know them at all and learning about their credentials and why they should be trusted and if they can actually help you. No, they just expect you to sign up and then open up your mind to them and have less privacy than you have with anyone ever in your life. And thus, in a sense, less boundaries either, and perhaps the highest degree of vulnerability. And they expect you to do it, like I said, without knowing or trusting them or being given any kind of real assurance that they are going to be able to help you, or that they're even going to, be the type of person you should be confiding in. And this is because most therapists are hacks who can't contribute anything valuable or meaningful to any conversation, and they become therapists just because they want that title and like listening to people's problems and want to think of themselves as people who help others and who most of all want to figure out how to treat their own emotional issues and may even want to be able to influence others with their agendas using the power of psychology. And you should know that most therapists live in a bubble of privilege. A term for this is being an armchair therapist. And they have extremely limited life experience and world experience and no idea what it is like to go through hardcore problems themselves and to live a life full of pain and suffering. And thus they cannot possibly even begin to help people who are. And, when they do, the suggestions that they throw out are completely unrealistic and stupid, often patronizing, because armchair therapists have no idea what it is like to really struggle. They live their lives in an ivory tower among the educated university elite class and those of high socioeconomic status, and then give advice to people who are struggling with the worst aspects of the human condition, like they can relate. Things they couldn't possibly understand or help with. But since they have read books, they feel confident enough to pretend that they can help. But their advice usually just shows you just how cut off from the situation and distant and ignorant about it they are, as their advice is usually so unrealistic that it's laughable. And this is the problem with these so-called intellectual academics and scholars. The problem that Dr. Thomas Sowell has written entire books about. They cannot give advice to people who they have no firsthand real-world knowledge of the situation of, simply based upon their book smarts, which doesn't translate to reality because it's not even based on good science. So I remember when the best therapist I ever saw said one of the stupidest things to me. I came in and he asked me about what I was, thinking and feeling and going through and everything. And I told him I was feeling, really nervous and insecure and overwhelmed because I needed money and I needed to survive. And I had all of these problems that were stemming from living in poverty. And, I was thinking of, giving up my business, which was failing, and trying to find work, but I wasn't getting any callbacks, and I needed to find a way to make money so that I could pay rent and survive. And he said, "Have you thought about going back to school?" I'm like, school costs money. I need money now. Why would you even say that? That's the stupidest possible advice. So that I could become homeless now, but somehow find a way to make it through school and go into debt and maybe get a job years down the line. How is that helping me? It's not. They cannot help you. They cannot relate to people in a lower position because these are intellectual elites that live in a bubble atop an ivory tower. When it comes to people who have real trauma, therapists are in over their heads and do not have any tried and true methods that guarantee they will actually help you get better. And often they will have a person recall all of their trauma, recapitulate every traumatizing, detail that happened to them, effectively putting them back into that state and re-traumatizing the patient while doing so. And then after putting them through all of that emotional turmoil, the therapist will not even be able to do anything to actually help them with their emotions, and will have in effect just made the person worse off than they were before they came in for the session. And if you're really unlucky and they're really unequipped to deal with you, they may just call first responders and have you placed under mental health arrest and sent to the psych ward or a psychiatric hospital, which is a lot of fun. And one of the biggest problems and issues that I see with psychotherapy is that it isn't focused on identity building and personal development and teaching people how to have a greater sense of self or build character. All it's focused on is that mental masturbation and enabling people to have their emotional issues become worse by putting them under a magnifying glass without actually fixing them. Therapy and psychology isn't focused on diagnosing mental problems so that they can be solved, just talking about one's feelings and one's daily life and the issues they experience on a day-to-day basis, endlessly, week after week. Another problem in the field is that psychiatry and psychotherapy do not work together as they are supposed to. Psychoanalysis, or the science of actually figuring someone out mentally, is now a thing of the past. Psychotherapy now is just talk therapy, where someone talks about their problems and the therapist mainly listens without helping figure the person out. Group therapy is another alternative that is recommended, which is even more diluted, dumbed down, generic, and undermines individual differences among group members, and even often treats adults like children, patronizing them, and is really just a way to get more money per hour for one therapist's work, while the patients get less out of every session, less time to talk about themselves and their problems and issues, and less of the therapist's focus on them. Like I said, it's a business, and most therapists just treat their practice as a cash cow and are just trying to turn over as many patients as possible, as quickly as possible, without putting much effort or energy into actually helping any of them. All right, they are just looking to fill up their calendar with as many appointments with as many patients as possible. And if you've been in therapy, you probably noticed most don't even take notes on their patients when listening to them, let alone do case studies on their patients and try to contribute to the field of science. No, in fact, many of them are very unprofessional and even unethical. Many therapists allow their personal opinions and biases, such as political views, to cause them to act unprofessionally and be unhelpful whenever they may disagree with something a patient says, turning what is supposed to be a therapy session meant to help the patient into a debate meant to indoctrinate them or persuade them to change their mind, or worse, and I've had this happen to me, getting angry and attempting to make the patient feel guilty. I've literally had to walk out of therapy sessions where this was happening because I'm like, how is this therapeutic for me? It isn't. Getting attacked on the basis of your political beliefs about something I said that you disagree with. No, that's not right. But you see, the problem is that most therapists are women, and this is how they operate. A statistic from 2021 was that 70% of therapists are women, leaving less than 30% being men, because some of the rest actually think they are from some other made-up gender. God, thank God I never got paired with one of them. So if you are a man and you need therapy, you are most likely going to end up with a female therapist who, even if she isn't intentionally emasculating you and trying to feminize you, which does happen, she is at the very least going to be giving you advice from a female perspective. And she will not understand what it is like to be a man, or how the world treats us men, and what society expects from us men, and the types of problems and social issues that we have to face and the ways in which we struggle. So if she tries to help you deal with your problems, which she may just not, but if she does, she will be doing it as a woman from a female point of view, and thus will be telling you to do things in a feminine way. She'll be teaching you to communicate with others the way a woman does, and in ways that society does not respond well to when men do it. She will teach you to be open with your feelings and be more vulnerable and emotional with others and such, which is something that society rewards in women but punishes in men. But she doesn't know that because she's never been a man or tried enough to understand and empathize with them, right? And if you try to tell her that people won't respond well to that because it sounds feminine, she's just going to talk about your insecurities and how, you shouldn't be so insecure about your feelings. And pretty soon she may actually try to get you to become transgender. Keep in mind, psychotherapy is a very feminist field. So there are a lot of female therapists who will try to introduce you to transgender ideology and actively seek to feminize you. Or they may actually be feminists who are hiding the fact that they are man-haters and will be trying to subconsciously emasculate you and disempower you and undermine your masculinity, which she thinks of as toxic, as the APA has labeled traditional masculinity to be actually, quote, toxic masculinity. And so many therapists who are feminists believe that masculinity is inherently toxic and will be trying to subvert and maybe even shame it in you, even subtly. And in fact, since therapy is such a feminist field, you could even try to get around this by getting a male therapist you'd expect not to have these problems with because he's a man, and end up just getting one that is a male feminist and may even be more feminine than masculine, just as feminine as one of the female therapists you could have gone with, and ends up doing all of these same exact things wrong that female therapists do. Maybe even worse if he's woke, which is liable to happen because most therapists are leftists and liberals and find it difficult or impossible to tolerate those who are not and may have some other political opinion than them. We all know how wokesters react to those with different opinions, and therapists who are extremely far left and liberal find it similarly very difficult to contain themselves and be professional when someone is on the opposite end of the aisle in their office. So most therapists are these feminist extremists, feminazis, who are very misandristic towards men, especially white men. In any couples counseling, it will be quite clear that there is a bias towards the woman against the man. Family and couples therapists are often biased towards the wife and mother, even if she is the abusive one to the man in the relationship. Couples therapy is not generally therapeutic for the man or even safe for him. It's just enabling to the woman. And if you are a single man going into therapy and you talk about your dating life, you are still in danger of being disempowered and put down and even shamed by the female therapist if you are not dating in the exact way that she would like you to. Even though there's no women in the room for her to side with, she may still try to instill her feminist beliefs and misandry in you and your dating paradigm. So when I had something like this happen to me, I was talking about being polyamorous, and I was a pickup artist, but I didn't even say that. I was trying to use language that was politically correct with a female who was probably a leftist. So I told her I was polyamorous and that I enjoyed having multiple female lovers, that I was someone who enjoyed giving pleasure and stuff like that. And she literally acted like so offended and like I was doing something wrong, even though I hadn't said I was doing anything wrong, hadn't talked about violating consent or anything like that. But she still didn't like the idea of something I had said and got so offended that she literally became extremely cross with me and said, "What do you think you are, Don Juan or something?" And I was like, what the fuck? Whoa. Okay. And she starts trying to argue with me about it, or I don't know what she was saying after that because I was basically out the door so fast. I'm not going to sit there with a therapist who was becoming cross at me for being polyamorous. I know I hadn't said anything that was politically incorrect, but feminists obviously do not like the idea of a man being with multiple women. Right? And I know what many of you out there are thinking, well, if you get a bad therapist, just switch therapists. And if you get a bad therapist, then, just keep switching therapists, keep looking, right? Keep on looking for them, just like, you might look for another professional and go through many of those until you find the right one. But again, that is easier said than done. There's no easy solutions here because finding a good psychologist is very difficult for a number of reasons. And vetting them to make sure they are good is even more difficult because most of them do not respond well to those types of questions. Right? They don't like being interviewed for the job before they get it. Right? They like to just assume the sale. And if you try to interview them first, they will act very uncomfortable and act like you are doing something inappropriate, even though you're not, right? And if your therapist is ever being less than helpful or, saying or doing things that are harmful to you, and you were to start to disagree with them and tell them that you feel that way, chances are that they will not respond with agreement, but will simply accuse you of being the problem and not doing the work. And then they may even act like you're being a problematic patient and just drop you. And they can get away with acting like this because there are so many people out there with mental health issues these days in this mental health epidemic that we are having, this widespread mental health crisis, that it is a seller's market for therapists. Right? And they know that if they're just dropping the patients who don't like the way they do things or who they can't help, that there's just so many other people out there just waiting to sign up for therapy and get a chance at being helped. So because it is such a seller's market, they're able to dictate such unfair terms for their services and put such a high price tag on it without actually doing anything, much less guaranteeing anything, and having the power to do more harm than good. In fact, therapists have too much psychological power and influence over their patients, if you ask me. I mean, they have the power to alter their patient's state of mind, and yet they don't always use that to be a positive influence and do what is in their patient's best interest. For instance, they have the power to place you under mental health arrest anytime they feel that you, quote, may be a danger to yourself or others. And if they even suggest that you go to the mental hospital and you disagree and say you want to go home, they have the power to have you forcibly taken and restrained by police officers and other first responders and then locked up in a small room for some time. And any resistance will result in force being used against you. And depending on where you live, you could get tased. This actually happened to me once when I was going through a heart-wrenching breakup and cried to my doctor asking for an antidepressant. He suggested I see a psychiatrist and I agreed, but he couldn't get a hold of one right then. And he said he thought I should go to the hospital. And I disagreed, telling him I had a lot of things to do. And he excused himself from the room and left me there alone for 15 fucking minutes, wondering where he was and what the hell was going on. Eventually, I felt that I could not spend any more time sitting alone in that room, and that obviously I was dealing with an unprofessional doctor and I had to move on with my day and go about the things I had to do. But when I walked out of that room, I was surprised by a group of first responders who immediately put their hands on me. And when I went like that, just out of reaction, I was taken down by police officers and had my head scraped against the floor under a police officer's knee, had my bag cut off of me, and then I was restrained and forcibly taken to the hospital. And had to spend the rest of the fucking day there explaining to doctors that I wasn't suicidal, wasn't a danger to myself or others. I had just been depressed and cried a little. It was a traumatizing situation, honestly, that I was put in during a time that I was vulnerable and had opened up to a doctor who said he wanted to help me, but did more harm than good, and obviously had no respect for the kind of power and influence he has over his patients. And why was this able to happen? Because of another problem here, that these medical professionals generally do not record their sessions. And so when something like this does happen, it is your word against theirs. And who do you think is more believable? A doctor or someone who's under mental health arrest and is in a, quote, mental health crisis, as the doctor calls it? Though being under mental health arrest is really what makes it the crisis in most of these cases. And when that happened to me, in the end, I got over my heartbreak without seeing the psychiatrist, without the use of psychiatric medication or therapy, just like I would have always. And in this incident, the intervention of these, quote, medical professionals only made my life much worse. This is probably why most men find it difficult to ask for help when they need it and would rather either suffer through their problems or would literally rather commit suicide and die than to have to deal with one of these so-called mental health professionals. You know, people who will probably just cause them an even worse crisis than they're already having. And that's probably why most suicides occur and why most suicides are male, because they are easier on women in the way they treat them. But when a man is experiencing emotional instability, he gets treated like a criminal threat in need of detainment rather than a victim in need of help like women are. So it should be of no shock to you out there that with so many monumental problems with the entire field of psychotherapy, that we are actually in the middle of a mental health crisis and an epidemic of mental illness that mostly affects men and not women. And that when women have mental health issues, therapy actually is more helpful to them than it is to men, whom it harms more than it helps, which has created like this vicious circle of mental illness perpetuating itself in men, and us having nothing that we can do about it except just try to, be stoic and sit on our feelings, and try to stifle ourselves rather than expressing ourselves for fear of what repercussions may come if we were to let out any of our emotions. And that is not the way it should be. It's not good for us, and we should have the same rights as women to express ourselves and to be able to get the help and the resources that we need from society to better ourselves, especially with things that are actual medical disorders that should be diagnosed first and foremost, and then properly treated with real science. But we do not have any of that. That is the nature of the medical crisis that we are in right now. All we have are these hacks that call themselves medical professionals that are really just looking to exploit us for profit with a very high price tag. So that is part one of the male mental health crisis and problems with psychotherapy. And yet that is not even all of it. It is more than half, but I still have more issues to bring up on these topics, which I want to do with some real science and cold, hard facts. So you can stay tuned for the next video coming out tomorrow, which will be part 2 of this video. And that concludes this video. Thanks for listening. I hope I mansplained that good enough for you. If you like what you heard, please click the like button. And if you feel you gained some value from this video and would like to give some back, please do so with the PayPal link below, because your support helps fund me doing this work and fight the good fight for men like you. If you are ready to take the red pill and wake up from the matrix and the matriarchy controlling it and learn everything you need to know about female on male sexism, get your copy of my newly released book called Misandry Exposed, on sale now for a special price that won't last long. So check it out by clicking the link below. And otherwise, you can stay tuned for the next video coming out tomorrow on the mental health crisis, problems with therapy part 2. And until then, take care of yourselves, men, because no woman out there and no therapist are going to.